Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar From Phonics to Football, a winning game plan for K-8 literacy, presented by Amplify's Chief Academic Officer and host of Science of Reading the podcast, Susan Lambert, and Super Bowl champion, Malcolm Mitchell. We are so excited to have both of you here with us today. My name is Lauren, and I'm on the literacy marketing team here at Amplify. And we'd also like to share our Science of Reading Change Management Playbook. It will help you take the next steps in making the shift to the science of reading. It provides the necessary components of systematic change, evidence-based stages of implementation, and methods for creating and following an implementation action plan. I'll drop the link shortly in the chat so you can download your copy. And the URL is also on the screen in front of you. And now I'd like to introduce our first presenter for today, Amplify's own Susan Lambert. Susan is the Chief Academic Officer of Elementary Humanities at Amplify and the host of Science of Reading the podcast. Her career has been focused on creating high-quality learning environments using evidence-based practices. She is a former classroom teacher, administrator, and curriculum developer, and is dedicated to turning theory into best practices that educators can put right to use in the classroom and to showcasing national models of reading instruction excellence. Welcome, Susan. We're so glad to have you here with us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks so much for the introduction. And it's really funny because I'm sitting between the introduction and the thing the people really came for, which is Malcolm Mitchell. So before we let Malcolm talk, though, we're going to start with the phonics thing to transition all the way into football. So I'm super excited about this presentation, and mostly super excited that y'all are going to hear just a little bit from Malcolm Mitchell, and I think you're going to be pretty excited by what he has to say. Before we sort of get into Malcolm and his story, I want to just ground us in a reminder of what we're doing for literacy for all students. And for those of you that are teachers that have joined this webinar or other educators, I'm sure you've heard this and seen this millions of times. Well, maybe not millions, but there's a few frameworks I want to remind ourselves about. And keep these things in mind as we're thinking about developing skilled readers and skilled writers. I always say that sometimes we get so lost in all the great ideas and things people are telling us that if we don't have frameworks to ground our understanding, we can get lost, right? So I really encourage you to know these frameworks and use these frameworks as your North Star, as the way to say, okay, is what I'm doing to develop proficient readers in my classroom grounded in these areas. And the first thing that I want to remind us of is what we talk about when we talk about the science of reading. Now, the title of this webinar is From Phonics to Football. Obviously, reading, just like football, is not about one individual capacity or ability. And so for skilled reading, yes, word recognition is part of it. Part of word recognition is phonics. But we also have to remember that if you can't decode a word, or if you can't recognize a word's, or if you can decode a word and recognize a word, but you can't understand its meaning, you actually aren't comprehending anything, right? So even Goff and Tumner, the developers of this framework, said, nobody believes that decoding is the only thing that a skilled reader must do. You must understand the words that you're actually able to lift off a page. And this simple view of reading reminds us that language comprehension is that thing that develops naturally. Now, we have to encourage our students to develop even more of that as we pull them into the academic setting, or as an adult, right? I continue my language comprehension as I learn new topics or learn new vocabulary. And so we need to leverage our ability to communicate language as sort of what we're born to do. And we also need to explicitly teach word recognition. So that's a skill that we actually don't know how to do without some explicit instruction. And so this is set up as a multiplication problem on purpose, because again, if you had a 0 in language comprehension and had a 10 in word recognition, you still couldn't be a skilled reader. So just a reminder that we need both things to develop. Now, I like to talk to folks who have seen this simple view of reading model over and over and over again about the contributions each make, right? So we talked about the capacity for language, we talked about the capacity for word recognition, and we often see these two boxes the same size. But the reality is that each of these capacities inform reading comprehension or have an influence on reading comprehension differently based on where we are in the developmental process. So in K through 2, word recognition plays a much larger role in reading comprehension. And so as we're teaching kids to put sounds to print, understanding the alphabetic principle, kids blending to make words, this word recognition element of the simple view of reading plays the biggest contribution in reading comprehension. Notice, though, that when we get to grades 3 and up, language comprehension actually hits hard and heavy. And this is a really important concept because if we neglect the language development or language comprehension element of literacy in K2, we're not preparing our students for third grade and up. And so I often really encourage K through 2 teachers, pre-K teachers, that even though a lot of the work that we need to do in those grades is help kids understand how to lift the print off the page, you cannot neglect the skill of language development because that has a huge impact on students' reading comprehension and writing composition later on. Got to have a quote, right? Hugh Katz reminds us that it's not surprising when you're just learning how to read that decoding has the greatest impact. But the shift then happens in about third or fourth grade as kids become much better and much faster at decoding or become more automatic. And this is then the next framework that I want us to keep in mind as we're talking about this quest for literacy is Scarborough's rope, right? The elements of early reading. And I want you to notice the title of this slide, the elements of early reading. So what did Hugh Katz say in that quote on the last slide? Well, it makes sense for kids in the early grades that word recognition makes the biggest impact. But around third or fourth grade, sort of where these two ideas of language comprehension and word recognition come together, that's when we begin to make the shift. And by fourth and fifth grade, if students are progressing appropriately, given good instruction, we should be really tightly connected with our word recognition and language comprehension. You'll notice the simple view of reading here, right? Language comprehension at the top, word recognition at the bottom. We're going to pull all those things together to develop skilled reading. Now, before we actually got on this webinar, I was asking Malcolm, what are you reading? And the reason I asked him what you're reading is because I was kind of interested in the range of texts that he was engaging with. And he can talk about that when I give him the chance to do that. But the reason I like to know this is because, this language comprehension piece on top, that's all about building your knowledge and extending your vocabulary. And the thing is that as long as you are a lifelong learner and continue to read and continue to gain new knowledge and new vocabulary, that language comprehension element will continue to grow over time. And the more you know, the better you're going to get at being able to approach and comprehend texts at different levels, right? So comprehension isn't a either or proposition. It's a continuum. And the more that you know, the better you're able to comprehend the next text that you read about a similar topic. And so really, really good comprehenders have a broad range of knowledge, which gives them lots of vocabulary and flexibility with vocabulary. And so all that to say, the phonics part of it or the word recognition part of it, that's the element that we want to develop to automaticity with kids in early grade reading so that they can apply those skills to be really strategic in terms of what they're reading and they can grow their knowledge base. By the way, better comprehenders of texts that are growing in new knowledge are also better writers because it's really difficult to write about something that you don't know about. Okay, let's talk about the end of the rope here, end of Scarborough's rope. Many times I have people ask me, well, what does this mean? What does the Scarborough's rope or the reading rope mean for kids that are in middle school or high school? Well, if they're given good instruction and they're developing as they need to develop to be strong readers, it actually shouldn't mean anything. So pretend, and let me give you more about that. Pretend this pretty flowery thing is a cross section of a rope. I haven't gotten a really good illustration of this, but just pretend that you got this great rope, you cut the thing in half, and you're looking at the cross section. This cross section represents what our kids should be doing in middle and high school in terms of the integrated skills and processes. So, this comes right from Scarborough's article about the rope. Here's the thing, like if we think about the strands separately, individual printed words, comprehending the meaning of the words, we often, can keep ourselves in that silo, but really these two processes operate and develop interactively. And so skill in one area can bootstrap skill in another area. And so when we think about skilled reading, we want to think about the cross section of this rope where things all come together. So when I'm reading a book, when Malcolm's reading a book, we don't think about each individual strand, right? We cognitively have the ability to pull these things together as a skilled reader. Now, I'm not going to talk through this reading systems framework, but I want you to look at the cross section of the rope next to this framework, and I want to pull out a few important things. First of all, when you are strong in reading comprehension, there's actually 3 areas that are supporting what's happening inside your head. So you have knowledge of certain things, and that's knowledge of linguistics, orthography, you have academic knowledge, you have general knowledge of the world. You also have processes that you employ, right? Decoding, maybe, if you come to a word that you don't recognize, automatic word identification. You actually can do inferencing pretty quickly if you have the background knowledge to be able to do that. And, as good readers, we're often monitoring our comprehension. So again, Malcolm and I were talking before we got on this webinar, and Malcolm's like, yeah, this book is like not that easy for me to read because it's kind of boring, right? It's about numbers. It has no narrative story. You know what he's doing there? He was monitoring his comprehension and understanding that, man, it takes a lot of cognitive energy for me to engage in this text because it's more difficult to read. We also have then those cognitive resources or this working memory that can actually help us as well in terms of reading comprehension. So once we get all of those things in place, word recognition, we're starting to develop language comprehension with background knowledge and vocabulary and understanding how sentences are put together. Those things get tightly woven together. And what we're doing is employing a lot of processes when we read. One last thing, and I promise I'm going to turn it over to Malcolm, is okay, well, what about when kids in those middle and high school grades can't do that? What happens when we're supposed to have, right, these tightly woven things together? Kids aren't comprehending. Well, what we have to do in that situation is move backwards in the process. So if you're finding that your students are struggling with comprehension, maybe you're struggling with comprehension, think about these 3 different buckets or areas. Word recognition. Are the students able to automatically recognize words? Well, if they're not, what about those words aren't they recognizing? Can they read words fluently in context? If they can't, we have to go back further. Can they decode, and do they have sight word knowledge? If they can't, we might have to go back even further. So similarly with language comprehension, the same thing is we need to isolate where those areas of weaknesses are and then move backwards in this process to really identify the area that we need to support students. So all this to say is that reading is a really complex process. We talk about the simple view of reading and the reading rope, and it looks pretty straightforward, but there's lots of things happening within our brain to actually then produce this thing that we called skilled reading. This biliteracy model is just a quick way to say that when students are also learning simultaneously a language and a new language, it works very similar. We still need word recognition and we still need language comprehension, but we help draw on the first language to help support the second language. And I'll tell you that in the podcast, not that I'm advertising the podcast, but I am, in Science of Reading the podcast, we have lots of episodes, Malcolm's as well, that helps us really understand how these models work and details behind those models. Okay, promise I'm done, because folks are really here to hear the story of someone who has experienced a growth in literacy. And so it has always been the first time we did the podcast recording, an amazing experience hearing Malcolm's story. A little bit awestruck I was, right? So I am a football watcher as well. And so being able to meet Malcolm, a Super Bowl champion, a wide receiver who is a very talented individual. I also learned that Malcolm is a children's book author. And when we did that first podcast recording, when Malcolm left the room that we were recording in, I literally got on my phone on Amazon and ordered these two books and have them on my shelf now. They're just beautiful examples of the passion that Malcolm has and how he's bringing that to the world. And for those of you that don't know, he's also a champion of reading. And he'll probably talk a little bit more about his foundation. But I love, Malcolm, the mission of your foundation: to inspire kids to read to a better future. If that was the only part of your mission, it would be incredibly amazing. Because sometimes we think about reading being the end goal, but it's really reading as a means to something more. When we were doing our planning for this presentation, Malcolm said something to me that I told him I'm writing it down. I wrote it down. I have it on a piece of paper next to me. And I think it's really important. He said, every book I've ever read has given me a superpower. And I think that's just an amazing point of view towards what text can do for all of us, and really serves as just an amazing example of how you let literacy just sort of embrace your entire life. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Malcolm. And I don't think I'm going to read about the speaker, because most people know you're All-American football player. They now know that you love reading. If they listen to the podcast, you can find out when you actually learned that love of reading. And I'm pretty sure that you're going to tell us a little bit more about yourself. And somebody on the Ed website, if you could throw in a link to the Share the Magic Foundation, that would be amazing, so folks can look at that website. Malcolm, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to go off camera because we're here to listen to you, but I'm right in the background.
Well, I first want to say thank you to Amplify. I appreciate continuing to call me for these opportunities to speak and engage in hopefully meaningful ways. Lauren, thank you for prepping and making sure that I was prepared for these few moments that I'll have with everyone. And Susan, I've learned that I need to really pay attention when we're having conversations, because I didn't know you were diagnosing me throughout that process. But that's really cool. And you've become an extraordinary friend, and I just appreciate all the kind things that you say. Let me set the tone for the next 20 to 25 minutes. I am not a neurologist. I did not get a degree in education at the University of Georgia. That does not mean I don't possess the intellectual knowledge on all the things that Susan was talking about. In fact, I had seen those slides and I have been exposed to that information on numerous occasions. The strength of me having a conversation is not from highlighting the points that Susan was talking about. That's not how I best serve anybody who's listening to me at this very moment. My best use, or highest and best use, for the few minutes that we have with each other is to share my experience and my perspective. How in the world did a kid who grew up in a football-driven town begin to appreciate books and reading a lot more than actually scoring touchdowns and playing football? I think that's what I'm here to really talk about. And the only way that I could see myself successfully doing that within the amount of time we have is I have to get you to understand where I came from. I have to get you to understand what really defined the moment where I realized football wasn't necessarily the most important thing in the world. And then how I took all those experiences and perspective and created Share the Magic Foundation to start trying to promote literacy in a meaningful way. My perspective comes from my personal life, also comes from things that I've witnessed personally from being out in the communities. So, what I'm going to give you is a bit of the past so you can understand where I came from, the, the present so you can understand where I'm at today, and then my ambitions and thoughts about the future as it relates to literacy and the impact that reading has on stabilizing communities. So hopefully that's worthwhile. Hopefully you find it beneficial. And I can be long winded, but it's my plan to leave a little time just in case there are questions. So let's dive into the first part, my past. I need you to understand where I came from and not hear any of those accolades and get confused on where all this began. I grew up in Valdosta, Georgia, and I was just like every other child in that community. I gravitated towards playing football, and I did not understand the importance of an education. In fact, I spent most of my time in the cafeteria, the gymnasium, and the truth, I spent a lot of time in the in school suspension room. We called it ISS. I'm not sure if it's even still around, but I'm very familiar with the term. My greatest act of rebellion did not come until the second semester of my freshman year in high school. I thought that it would be a great idea to participate in senior skip day as a freshman. It was not that hard to pull off. My mom had to be at work long before I had to be at the bus stop. So on this particular day, my alarm goes off and I simply stay asleep. Eventually, I phone a friend and I asked that friend, because he had a vehicle, would he be kind enough to pick up this nice young lady that I was interested in? He obliged. And they came over. Nothing happened. I got quite bored, to be frank with you. And I came up with another splendid idea. That splendid idea was for us to go hang out at another friend's house. The biggest conundrum with that idea is that this friend's house was located directly across the street from the school. So 9-year-old ninth grade Malcolm decided that the best place to hang out while participating in senior skip day as a freshman in high school was directly across the street from the school. There's a lot we can uncover with how I got to that conclusion. But while I'm there, my phone vibrates and I receive a text message from another nice young lady, and she was asking me to come visit. Now, I know you can't tell now, I'm aging, but I used to be a very attractive young man. And I told her I'd be more than happy to come by. The only problem is I didn't have a vehicle and I didn't have a driver's license. So the most rational thing for me to do was to stay put. The most rational thing for me to do was to be in school. I was not making a lot of rational decisions today, and the next choice I made was not very different. I looked at my friend who had a vehicle and I asked to borrow the keys to his car. He said, Malcolm, can you drive? I said, of course. Truth is, I had never been behind the wheel of a vehicle. My brother, who's 1 year older than I am, his name is Marquise Mitchell, he was there. We can do a bit of critical thinking together. If he's 1 year older than I am, and I'm in ninth grade, and he's looking at me talking, and I'm skipping school, well, we can safely conclude that he was participating as well. He looked at me and he said, listen, I know you can't drive. Are you sure you want to make this choice? I looked at my brother square in the eyes, and then I looked back at that phone and saw the message from that nice young lady, and I said, yeah, brother, I think I'm going to try to pull this one off. 5 minutes later, I totaled the vehicle and I ran away from the scene of the accident. I ran away with a plan. The plan was that I go back to my friend who let me borrow his car and I tell him that his car's in the middle of the street and he has to go claim it. The police are definitely going to come. If you don't show up, they're going to be looking for us. All you have to do is tell them you got in an accident, one of your friends got injured, you wanted to make sure they were fine. Now you're ready to handle the situation. Insurance will cover everything. They ask you about the wounded friend. I'll play the role of the wounded friend. My friend looks at me and he says, I got you. And I think to myself, I'm off the hook. The guy who let me borrow his car goes back to the scene of the accident and he tells the police officers that someone stole the car. So now they're looking for a thief. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the show The First 48, but these police officers find me within the first 48 hours. Sad part is they handcuffed me in front of my mother and they sent me to the closest youth detention center. And I stayed there for a month. I stayed there long enough for the judge to conclude while I had done a lot of things that were not of great intent that day, I did not actually steal the vehicle. I was 13 years old when that happened. And based on the environment that I lived in, I got tagged with a lot of names like delinquent, misbehaved, poor student. I was told that my life would be like many of the people around me. I'd be in and out of jail, and that's all that I had to offer. By the time I turned 17 years old, some of the accolades that you saw on that screen as Susan was introducing me became very relevant. I was offered scholarships by every school you could think about by the time I turned 17. By the time I turned 21, I had started writing picture books, hoping to inspire kids to read. By the time I turned 22, I become a Super Bowl champion. Listen, the point of the story is not to inundate you with accolades that I don't think prove of any value. The point of the story is to say that you never give up on your kids. And it's also to give you a bit of insight of the environment that I grew up in. Um, People use phrases like poverty pocket and book desert. That's where I existed as a child. Also, Valdosta, Georgia is known for having the winningest high school football program in the country. ESPN hosted a competition called Titletown USA to find the winningest sport program. And they didn't pick the Chicago Bulls during the Michael Jordan era. Lauren, they did not pick the Philadelphia Eagles, because I heard the comment you made before we started. And they did not pick the New England teams and all their rich tradition. During that competition, and it included high schools, colleges, and professional organizations, Valdosta High School's football program won as the winningest sport program in the history of this country. So, what was the most rational or easy decision for me to make as a kid growing up in Valdosta, Georgia? Well, it was to play football. And that's what I decided to do. There were no tangible examples of education taking anyone anywhere that was culturally desirable in my neighborhood. On the first day of school, you'll ask students what they want to be, and they'll say doctors and lawyers or other professions or some type of entrepreneur, where there were no examples of that existing successfully anywhere in eyesight. So trying to get some of these students to believe that something as delayed gratification as education is, because that's the truth, it's very hard. Why is it difficult? Because we're just trying to get to the next day. In high school, I focused on playing football. And because there were no culturally relevant connectivity points for me to understand how an education would help me get from point A to point B, I did not focus on it. In fact, the students who were getting straight A's in my school Well, they were getting picked on and ridiculed. I never saw their name in the newspaper for any of their academic performances. I never saw them called out in front of the school during a pep rally to honor them for how much they studied or their report card. I never witnessed any of those things. So for me to grow up in an environment and remember the perspective in which I'm coming to the conversation, I'm coming to this conversation as a child who grew up in an under-resourced community where the only thing that we want more than anything else is not to be there. I didn't grow up in an environment where this idea or there's this plethora of knowledge or concrete understanding that education mattered because you couldn't point to it. You couldn't exemplify that. You couldn't connect the dots culturally for me to understand how this was going to help me make sure my mom didn't have to work all those jobs her whole life. But football, well, it was very easy to understand. Why? Because every touchdown I scored, they put my name in the newspaper. When I became an All-American, they hosted a pep rally. When I scored more than 3 touchdowns or broke a school record, my picture got into the front of the newspaper. All of that was cementing the idea that many kids grow up in this country with, is that athletics or getting attention in any capacity is greater than your academic prowess. And hopefully I've pointed to a few reference points that allows you to understand how that idea became cemented in my brain as a child. Because when I scored a touchdown, I was treated a lot different than the students who were getting straight A's, who were studying, who were reading, who were spending time in the library. So there was nothing that truly pointed me in that direction. That's the past. I want to keep working my way through the past a little bit because I think I need to close the gap on, okay, if that's where I started in high school, how in the world did I get to college and begin to challenge some of that thinking? I did just enough to get into the University of Georgia on an athletic scholarship. And in that environment, I was exposed to things I had never witnessed before. In Valdosta, Georgia, I would say 90% of the students were behaving as I did. We were just trying to get to the next day. And if you're an athlete, you were just trying to be the best athlete you could be. Well, at the University of Georgia, 99% of those students understood how they would leverage their academic performance, leverage their degree to create financial opportunities in the future. Now, this is the first time me as a young Black kid growing up in a low-income environment, being exposed to this new environment, began to understand that an education could take you some places that were pretty relevant and desirable for anybody who's growing up in a low-income community. This is the first time that I'm flirting with the idea that, oh, school may actually be of some value outside of playing football. I was in my English 1102 class, and we were studying Edgar Allan Poe. And there is a moment in class where the teacher introduces popcorn reading. Now, they've changed the name over time. I've heard reading circles, round robin reading, but for me, it was popcorn reading. And for those who are unaware, popcorn reading is when one student is called to read and they get to choose whatever student in the classroom they want to read. Now, this is a non-reader's nightmare. I mean, this is my deepest fear coming into reality, because in Valdosta, it wasn't that terrible to be, a struggling reader, because we all were. It was more common than not. Well, at the University of Georgia, when I heard these students open their mouth to read, it wasn't even understanding the complexities of phonemic awareness or the science of reading that jarred me. It was just their ability to vocalize the words on the page. And I knew deep down that that was something that I could not do. And while I began to realize that I had some challenges associated with reading, the idea of it being important still wasn't relevant. Why? Well, you got to understand my reality at the moment. I'm all SEC freshman of the year. My professors are asking to take photos with me to share with their family. That girl who read that short story, Edgar Allan Poe, I never got her name. So for me, connecting the dots was the most central part of the formula. Why does this matter? Why should I invest in something that is not natural to do? Susan explained it's a learned skill. It takes practice. It takes formation. It takes combined resources. It's not that you just wake up one day and you can read. It's an acquired skill. So why would I go through the process of acquiring this skill if I can't understand how it has any benefit to the long-term desires I want for my life? Because I'm not just reading to read. How can this information be applied to get me to the next stage of my personal evolution? As a kid growing up, I didn't understand that. And even in college, when I'm having this Edgar Allan Poe moment, I still don't understand it. I'm just simply identifying I struggle with something that all these other students seem not to struggle with as much. I'm in my same English 1102 class, and here's the moment where things begin to pivot a little bit and I start connecting the dots. I'm in my same English 1102 class, and we get reports back on the short story, A Telltale's Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, and one student loses her mind on the students. And I'm not exaggerating. She loses her mind. I mean, on the one student loses her mind on the teacher, and she goes ballistic. Listen, I grew up in a tough environment. I saw fights. I saw things that are probably not appropriate to say. I had never seen a student yell at an educator for the grade they received on an assignment. I was so perplexed by what was taking place. I looked around and I asked the other students in the class, what did she get that is making her so upset? And someone told me that she received an 89 on her assignment. And I thought to myself, man, I got like a 70, and I thought about hanging mine up on the refrigerator. From my understanding, a 70 and a 90 sound like we're headed in the same direction, because the students who got C's on their report card ended up going on to the next grade level just as the students who got an A. That was my psyche. That was my train of thought. I was so flabbergasted by the situation. I go back to my computer one night and I type in, why do grades matter? And I looked at that content for maybe 13 seconds, and then I typed in on YouTube Jay-Z rap videos. If you understand how YouTube works, it begins to auto-populate content if you don't click a button. While I was watching these Jay-Z rap videos, I fell asleep. And this is before the concept of algorithms and YouTube or Google using what you search to come up with content. So I guess I watched enough of the Jay-Z rap videos while I was asleep that I wake up to him sitting down having a conversation with another gentleman. At the time, I had no idea who it was. Come to find out, a year later, it was Warren Buffett. That's not what's compelling. What's compelling during this interview is Jay-Z. If you don't know who Jay-Z is, it's Beyonce's husband, by the way. Jay-Z is talking about how he leverages reading books to develop the ability to brainstorm real time and recite the music that he makes. Now, Jay-Z is known for never having to write down his lyrics. He remembers them, and he's crediting reading to giving him the ability to rap in this extraordinary way that no one else has really accomplished at scale. I don't know if you've watched many Jay-Z rap videos, but there aren't a lot of academic references. So here's this cultural icon talking about books. The next video I'll watch is one of Curtis Jackson, 50 Cent, and he's sitting down and he's talking with a guy named Robert Greene. Robert Greene is responsible for books like The 48 Laws of Power, The 33 Strategies of War, Mastery, The Laws of Human Nature, and The Art of Seduction. He's one of the most credible writers, period. And 50 Cent is sitting down with this gentleman talking about writing a book called The 50th Law. Now, a little history on 50 Cent. 50 Cent became relevant as a musician by being shot 9 times. I don't know if you've watched a lot of 50 Cent videos. I don't know if you've listened to a lot of 50 Cent music. But I can promise you there aren't a lot of academic references. So for me, to see these two people that had some cultural influence talking about how they're using books to empower their future and help them make strategic choices to get where they want to be at in life, well, you gotta understand I'm shell shocked because I didn't know people like me could read. No, it's not that I'm not making the claim that I didn't know black males could read. I didn't know black males who come from environments that I come from could read. I didn't understand that males with the same cultural ambitions that I possessed at the time could read. Why? Because I never saw anybody covered in tattoos, and you can't see my arms now, but I'm covered in tattoos. I never saw anyone covered in tattoos at the local bookstore in Valdosta, Georgia. I never saw anyone who had the ambitions of becoming an NFL football player sitting at the local bookstore. I never saw, let me think of some other cultural points at the time. At the time, if you had on a gold necklace, some jewelry, you were really cool. That was culturally desirable to have those necklaces. I didn't see anybody at the bookstore or walking around Valdosta, Georgia, carrying books and reading with those necklaces on. I never saw anyone with the nice car with the big red. I didn't see it. So the idea that I could participate in the activity, it never crossed my mind because that must be an exclusive activity for people with certain criterias that I don't meet. That's how I was thinking until I saw those two interviews. And when those two individuals said that reading has helped them ensure that they can maintain their financial freedom and they leverage information from the books they read to help make choices, you got to understand that that's a revolutionary moment in my mind because I finally begin to conclude that reading is not about just about reciting words on a page. Reading is a tool and a mechanism I can use to stabilize any success that I have on the football field, but also empower me to think strategically in other areas of life to create more opportunities. And a kid growing up in an under resourced community wants more than anything else is not to be there. And after I watched those videos, I began to conclude that reading can help me ensure that I do not have to return under the same conditions. Everything that Susan stated before I started this portion of our conversation makes perfect sense to me today. And I understand it. Why do I understand it? Because football is a skill. Nobody's born to play football. Yes, you're predisposed to certain things that give you that ability, like my hands are awkwardly big. Fair enough. Some kids may grow up in a household where books are in surplus, but that doesn't mean they know how to read. And just because I have big hands doesn't mean I know how to catch a football. What I'm stating is the moment I realized that reading was something that I could use to empower my future, uh, my relationship with it begins to change. There's only one really big problem, to be honest with you, is that I had never voluntarily read a book my entire life. I think our senior year, To Kill a Mockingbird was a required read. Well, no, I didn't read it. And I didn't care what happened to that little spider in Charlotte's Web because my friends were actually dying. But once I conclude that reading was not just about reciting words on a page, that it could help me ensure that my mom didn't have to work, all those jobs her whole life, well, then it begins to have some cultural relevance, right? It begins to make sense. It begins to add up. The dots become connected, not because of phonemic awareness, but simply my desire to be the best version of me, right? And I think that's what many people want. There's this story that's called the Eagle Story, and it's about an egg being misplaced in a chicken coop. And when these eggs begin to hatch, this misplaced egg hosts an eagle. And there's this eagle that grows up with chickens. And for a majority of its life, it pecks the grounds for seeds and it flaps its wings to jump instead of fly. But one day, it begins to feel like it has a little more to offer, but it does not know what because all it knows is life with and as a chicken. Well, one day there's a shadow casted over the chicken coop, and our little misplaced eagle sees another bird soaring through the air, so it decides to give it a try. And after failing hundreds of times, it builds the strength to fly away from that chicken coop and live off its full potential. Well, how do I make that story relevant to what I'm talking about? Well, I felt like that little misplaced eagle. And I think there are millions of students around this country that feels like that little misplaced eagle. And they're trying to figure out how to fly. And sometimes we get bogged down into believing that, oh, it's football or it's some sport, or if it's some sense of source of entertainment, or it's TikTok, or it's Instagram, or there's all these different things that we latch onto that we believe will help us soar to truly live out our full potential. Because I think that's what many people are trying to do. I think that's what many students are trying to do. In fact, I have never walked in a room, and I walk into a lot of rooms, and asked the question, who wants to depend on government assistance programs? And people just throw their hand in the air. I've never witnessed that. I've never walked in a room and asked a group of people if they want to interact with the criminal justice system, and they just flail their hand in the air. I've never asked a person if they want to struggle their entire life to find financial resources to survive, and they say, hey, me, I'll take that. I've never witnessed that. So that tells me that people innately don't want that outcome. Well, those are the consequences of low literacy. And I was just lucky enough to conclude that it was not football that would set me free, but it's the critical thinking skills and analytical skills that I would develop through reading books that would truly allow me to be whatever I chose. So, how was I going to become a reader? Well, I took the same approach I did with sport. I started with the fundamentals. I started picking up picture books like The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and I got to watch what I say now because I think some of them have been banned. But, you know, I guess that's a topic for another day. But stories like the Very Hungry Caterpillar, The Giving Tree, and there's a book called Exclamation Mark, and I remember those started my journey. And I would write down words that I had never seen before. I would pay attention to sentence structure, and I really respect punctuations because while I was not necessarily decoding, I was using all those different mechanisms to help me kind of develop a formula to become a reader well enough for phonemic awareness to catch on. And I was much older. I was like 19 or 20. So we weren't working with a elementary school brain here. So, I kind of sped through the process. But what changed the game for me is vocabulary. The more words I began to learn, uh, it just helped the process become a lot smoother. And I started equipping myself with information to drastically change the outcome or perceived outcome for my life. The biggest example of that is when I started writing picture books. Because how in the world does a kid who thought football was the only thing conclude that reading is pretty cool and then start writing picture books to inspire kids to read? Well, I credit books for that. Every book, Susan's right, every book I've read has given me an idea, has given me a thought. It's equipped me with some level of understanding that I did not possess before I started reading that book. It's through books and reading books that I became inspired to write them and to share stories that I thought would be relevant. And that kind of centralizes the present moment that I'm making, right? Past, present, future. The present is that Share the Magic Foundation was born off of all those stories that I've just tried to communicate to the best of my ability. I grew up as I, every negative literacy statistic that I've ever come across, I fit within. Right? Family only makes a certain amount of money. You don't have both parents in the home. You don't have a certain amount of age appropriate books in the home. Not reading on grade level by third grade. I mean, you name them. I existed within all of those. So when you look at the landscape of literacy and the students who are not reading, I represent those who struggle the most. Why could I make that claim? Because I was that child. I'm glad I could run really fast. So I was the person with that past. That's where I began. Through exposure, being put in situations where I had to think differently, college, I was immersed in an atmosphere that forced me to challenge my current way of thinking at the time. And I conclude that, you know what? It's not actually football, but it's actually reading. It's actually brain development, my intellectual prowess, my ability to think and articulate my perspective is what I possessed that was most powerful, not whether I could catch a football or not. And then it's taking that and then kind of investing in the process of reading, and then investing in the process of writing, and then learning the statistical evidence that I possess today that helped me conclude that if I wanted to have a role on stabilizing communities, it was through inspiring kids to read. And the reason I chose inspiration is because I possess what majority of them want, and that's the experience with sport. Right? Every school I walk into, they question me until someone says he was a Super Bowl champion, and now I'm cool. And what that really does is that grants me an opportunity to interject other messages that I think is more beneficial than me playing football, which is if you want to stabilize your life in any capacity, you should read. That is how I got from Valdosta, Georgia to where I am today. And what I think about the future is if we truly want to build stable communities, if we want to enhance workforce development, if we want to maximize our potential, not as individuals, but a group of people, we have to focus on literacy rates and we have to get more people reading. And that's very difficult with technology as prevalent as it is. How do we find a formula that works? I don't know, but I hope to share any perspective that I have that helps us come to um, some possible solutions.
Amazing and powerful, Malcolm, as always. And I sort of think about what you had to go through, the sort of the logical sequence of things to teach yourself how to read and how you related that to how you learned how to play football. Um, and you probably think about it and talk about it and think, well, it wasn't really that big a deal, but kind of was a pretty big deal for you to actually do that for yourself. So kudos. It's such a great
Yeah,
story.
I don't think much about. I don't think a lot about because it's seen at the time as simple as well. I wasn't always a good football player, so how did I become a good football player? And it was practice, it was repetition, it was
Mm-hmm.
starting at the easiest place, and then you build your skills over time.
That's right.
This is before I conclude that reading is not a natural activity, but a learned skill. So I think that's kind of cool. But
Yeah, very cool. Well, and just so you know, like we're tattoos all over. Who knew that somebody interested in reading science could also be a tattooed individual? So breaking barriers is really important. And I think we had a couple questions in about like
okay.
how do you inspire middle school kids that don't how do you motivate them when they don't know how to read? What do you do? What would be your answer to that question?
My least favorite thing to do is to lift weights. Hated it. Man, I don't like to use that word, but I hated it. As soon as I got into a position where they wouldn't make me do it, I stopped doing it. So the question is, Malcolm, if you hated lifting weights, why did you do it for 15 years nonstop? Well, I clearly understood how that would impact my desired outcome.
Mm,
I ran away from books, skipped school when I knew we were going to read Romeo and Juliet aloud. I would pretend that I needed to use the restroom to get out of being called on for popcorn reading. I ran away from the activity until I realized the impact it would have on my long term outcomes. Now, for middle school students, it may not be a house and a car, it may be
right.
a pair of jeans or a pair of sneakers, or it may be associating it with some desire they have for their family. Because, yes, we can use vernacular that um, we need to enhance the deep reading brain. Middle school students don't care about that, right? What they care about is how is this activity going to get me what I want? And if we can't sufficiently answer the question, we can't expect them to engage in a meaningful way. So I don't have an answer to the question, but your student will tell you by simply
Okay.
asking, what would make you interested?
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that. Well, I know the recording is going to be available afterwards in the chat there. We have put links to both your books as
Okay,
well
awesome.
as to Share the Magic Foundation, so folks can actually go and dig into more of what you're doing. So, Lauren, I'm going to invite you up. I think you might have some closing comments for us.
First of all, thank you so much, Susan, for your presentation, getting us off with the science of reading. And Malcolm, thank you so much. I want to echo Susan's sentiments. Your story is so inspirational and so powerful. We applaud you for everything that you've done, both off the field and on the field. Your story is so inspirational to those educators joining with us today, bringing it back to their classroom and for their students as well. And I can't wait to purchase your picture books and read them to my 20-month-old daughter. And to all of our educators joining us today, thank you for joining us. We're so glad to have you here. And I want to give another chance for you to learn with Susan Lambert as we announce our brand new Foundations to the Science of Reading online course. So join fellow educators evaluating their teaching strategies with Amplify's new Science of Reading self-paced online course. And you can learn more about it at amplify.com/SOR course. Brand new, so check it out. And with that, I want to say thank you again, Susan. Thank you so much, Malcolm. And thank you to all of our attendees today. We're so glad you're able to join us for this inspirational and invaluable session. Have a great rest of your day.